Hey Rick, like I said, I've been going out and observing some of my coworkers' sessions, and I've been seeing quite a few different varieties and different types of behaviors. So I have some questions that I wanted to ask you on that topic.
Absolutely.
So, as far as detrimental behaviors, when are behaviors considered detrimental for a student?
Okay. Well, look, since we're in a school setting, I think the thing that we would consider in terms of, the word detriment are behaviors that impact the rate of learning that a student would encounter if they didn't have those behaviors. Okay? So if you don't have any disruptive behavior, you're paying attention, you're compliant, you're listening, you're sitting, your rate of acquisition of skills, given your potential for learning, should be fairly high. Okay? But if you have inattention, you're only complying half the time, or you have control battles constantly, or even aggression, or high levels of self-stimulation, which you're checked out, that's going to diminish the rate of learning that you will experience because you're engaged in all these off-task behaviors. Okay, so if we're thinking in the word detriment, that's what we would consider detrimental, or problematic. There's different terms that you hear: problematic, disruptive, all those terms you can kind of link together in terms of its behavior that's interfering with the student's rate of learning acquisition.
Okay.
Okay. So those are things you would
sense.
consider detrimental or disruptive.
Okay.
Okay.
Another thing I've been hearing is this word target behavior. What exactly is a target behavior?
Yeah. Well, look, now, given that list of behaviors that we just kind of talked about,
Yes.
okay, so there's an array of disruptive behaviors, right? And generally, kids have more than one,
Yes.
So what we would look at doing is decide, okay, which behavior are we going to work on, okay, proactively in terms of developing a new behavior to replace it. Like, if a kid's hyper non-compliant, what's the alternative? We want to build compliance, right?
Yes.
If a student's engaging in a high levels of self-stimulation, which essentially means they're not paying attention, what do we want to build? Attention, okay? So we decide on what the target behavior is. Now, the target behavior can mean two things. It could be, what are they doing wrong, and what do we want to teach them to do right? I mean, you could really consider those a target behavior, but you're really working on two behaviors
I see.
simultaneously,
Okay.
right? Developing the new behavior and minimizing the disruptive behavior, right? Okay. So essentially, and then our reinforcement is contingent on not reinforcing the disruptive behavior that we're working on, and we all decided to work on
Yes.
and select as the main priority, right? And we're using reinforcement to develop the new appropriate skill.
Okay.
Okay? So not reinforcing the old disruptive behavior, highly reinforcing the new replacement behavior. Okay? And essentially that is our target
That's our
behavior.
target, okay.
Because we're all working on that skill together as a team. And
Okay.
we've all decided that's what the reinforcement is going to be used for.
As opposed to trying to work on a whole bunch of different behaviors at the same time.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
selecting.
Right,
Okay.
right.
Okay. Again, I've been seeing a lot of different behaviors out there. I'm just wondering, are there some common behaviors that I will encounter as far as working with students with autism?
Well, look, certainly when you're working with younger students, okay, there's a number that you'll see that are pretty common, and you'll see them more frequently. One is just general noncompliance,
Yes.
right? Now, kids might do that for different reasons. Some kids just may not be paying attention to your instruction, and they just disregard it and move, throughout the day with what they want to engage in, right? So they're blowing you off. Other kids act out, right, and become non-compliant. So they'll engage in aggression, or they'll get argumentative, or become have protests, and they'll exhibit their non-compliance in that kind of way. Okay, but generally non-compliance is a big one.
Non-compliance.
Okay, a lot of times you'll see kids engaging in high levels of self-stimulation. You know, and that can manifest in different ways too. You know, some kids, we kind of term it as more primitive stims, which means like hand flapping, spinning out. It's a lot of just zoning into a very specific stimuli, and certainly a stimuli that doesn't really have any meaningful use in the environment, right? You know, so if I'm staring at a line of things, there's nothing really productive about that, right? Now, other kids may engage in self-stimulation around language. You know, we call it scripting. So they'll watch movies and then they'll repeat the lines of movies over and over and over again. Okay. Now, look, and there's probably a million other kind of stims that we can go into. Okay. But I guess the definition or the characteristic of it is it's repetitive. It generally isolates you more, right? Because you're so absorbed in it, you're not recognizing what's going on around you. You're not cueing into friends. You're not cueing into instruction. You're not cueing into things in the environment because you're so hyper-focused on the stimuli. And you do it over and over and over and over again. Okay. So that's another typical behavior that we'll run into.
Okay. I've been also been hearing about this escalation cycle, I think it's called. What exactly is that escalation cycle?
Well, look, it's the escalation cycle is a way of conceptualizing the phases of somebody getting really upset. Okay, and now well, let's go through like the components of it first. Okay, so the first component of the escalation cycle is gosh, I can't remember. It's the trigger. Okay. So it's something in the environment that starts to get you upset. Now the key word is starts, right? So you're annoyed, you're irritated, you're frustrated, you're hyper anxious. Some stimuli in the environment starts you down that road. Okay. Now, as you're starting down that road, if the stimuli maintains itself and you don't have an appropriate escape from that stimuli, your level of agitation, your level of frustration begins to climb. Okay? Because you're stuck. You have no way of getting away from it, right? And you're stuck in something that irritates you. You know, just like if you got in a fight with your boyfriend and girlfriend and they're not leaving you alone, you get madder and madder and madder and madder, right? And then you continue to escalate. Now, at some point, you hit a point that's called crisis. Okay? So at this point, you've lost yourself entirely. You're so immersed in your agitation and your anger and your stress that what started it is no longer being thought about. Okay? Now you're just upset because you're upset. Okay? And that can translate into a lot of things. That could translate into aggression, either towards property or towards people or towards yourself. Okay? And now there's not really much either that staff can do. Usually if it gets to that point, it's a waiting game at that point. Because the more you try to interact with a person that's in crisis, you're just adding another element of agitation, right? So as long as the person is safe, okay, and not being hyper-destructive, right, and putting themselves in a danger or other people in a dangerous situation, the best thing to do is just back off and wait, right? Now what happens is you can't maintain that state forever, right? Fatigue enters the game now. Right? So at some point, you start to de-escalate, okay? Now we can start to intervene again, actually, right? We can reinforce for de-escalation, right? So even though we've gone through a pretty lengthy time of being hyper-agitated, I think the error a lot of people make is, well, you've just had an episode, I don't want to reinforce you now. But it's actually more effective if the student is in the de-escalation phase to start reinforcing de-escalation. right? Because that's a behavior that's different than escalation,
Yes.
right? We want de-escalation to
Okay.
occur. Okay, so we can start say, hey, wow, you're looking really calm. You want to go sit in front of a movie, or you want to listen to some music now.
Yeah.
You can start to offer things for de-escalation.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the last bit is that generally the kids hit a depressive state. Okay, so now they actually dip under their normal state of being, right? So that's when you see the tears start to come out.
Okay.
That's when you see the this kind of thing. So if kids have a language, that's generally when they apologize. I'm
Okay.
sorry, I'm
Okay.
sorry, I'm
Okay.
sory. Okay, and you hit that depressive age. Now, you certainly don't want to reinforce that, right? Because we don't want to teach people to become depressed, right? So we'll say it's fine, don't worry about it, it's okay, you're good, and then we try to get them back up a little bit to where they're just functioning again,
see.
just doing,
Okay.
normal activities.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's the cycle, all right?
Yes.
Last question. Compliance hierarchy, I think it's called. I've been hearing so what exactly is a compliance hierarchy?
Yeah. Look, you don't always have to use compliance hierarchies, but when you're starting off with a kid that's hyper non-compliant, like we talked, that's one of those kind of typical behaviors that we see. It's probably a good idea for the person that's working with that student to rank in terms of what's the potential for a student to become non-compliant with this type of instruction. Okay? So there's certain instructions that the kid is definitely not going to do. Okay? And then there's maybe a category where the kid might or might not do it, right? Which could be like, hey, let's go watch a movie, or let's go listen to some music, right? And then there's a category which the kid is probably more than likely to do.
Yes.
Let's have some cookies,
Okay.
right? Let's have a piece of candy. You're all right, let's do it. Let's go to Disneyland. Okay, let's go, right? So the kid's gonna comply, right? So what you wanna do initially, if you have a really hyper non-compliant kid, is do a mixture of like definites and maybes.
Okay.
And you stay away from the definitely nots,
I see.
right, initially, because you're just gonna get non-compliance, right? So let's build a momentum of being compliant by using those types of instructions first,
Okay.
right? And then as the kid, because we reinforce it, right?
Yes.
And we'll say things like, hey, you're following directions, that's great. Here's your,
Okay.
payoff,
Yes.
right? So the students learn to become more compliant in our presence with us giving them direction, okay? And then over time, now we're gonna try one of the harder ones,
I see.
right? But as we build up their compliance, right? So it's just a systematic way of being, building up the compliance hierarchy.
Got it. Makes total sense.
Okay.
All right, I think that's all I have for now, so I appreciate your time, Rick.
Absolutely.
All right.
Take care.
You too.